The following is an article entitled The Doctrine of the Atonement, continued from an earlier edition of the Reformed Presbyterian Magazine, but this part of it taken from the November 1838 edition. Many who are otherwise upon what is usually called Calvinistic ground suppose the atonement to be indefinite. The doctrine itself is so general and so far abstracted from common view, and the language in which it must be expressed so indeterminate, that its inconsistency is less obvious than that of the other opinions which we have mentioned and rejected. The phrase indefinite atonement communicates but a vague idea to the mind, and imparts to the doctrine a pliableness which renders it, in the opinion of many, capable of harmonizing with any set of ideas which man may choose to entertain relative to evangelical truth. In examining, too, this system, we virtually examine the fundamental doctrine of both the Arminians and Universalists, and so preclude the necessity of more particular attention to their arguments. This is the doctrine of universal redemption in its least obtrusive form. The radical principle is evidently one. Messiah in his atonement had no more respect to the sins of the elect than to all the transgressions of men, and the best defenders of universal redemption have recourse to this hypothesis. It is the one adopted and recommended by Arminius himself. The notion of indefinite atonement is not at all a novelty in the Christian Church. Several writers before the time of Arminius made use of general terms respecting the purchase of Christ. That shrewd man was himself much more cautious and vague in his expressions than were Episcopus and others of his followers. Some of the Continental writers, too, who supported the Calvinistic system, endeavored to generalize theology, and thereby put an end to the controversy between the advocates of universal and particular redemption, by teaching that whatsoever is particular to the system of grace is to be attributed not to the satisfaction which Jesus made for sin, but to the application of its benefits to sinners according to the decree of predestination. This sentiment excited among divines in the British Isles much sensation. In Scotland, zeal for the doctrine of indefinite atonement induced several ministers and congregations, in every other sentiment Calvinistic, to separate from all former ecclesiastical connections and organize a distinct church, having no Christian communion with those who differed from them. The presbytery of that church is now extinct. The doctrine, however, is still maintained by many divines, distinguished for their talents and their piety, both in Europe and America. Many of its advocates, we are confident, consider themselves as opposed to Arminianism and are not aware of the coincidence of their favorite doctrine on the subject of atonement with the sentiments of the founder of that sect, and yet we cannot state their opinions in words more appropriate than those which he employed about the sufferings of our Redeemer, quoted as a subject of criticism by the learned Dr. Twiss, procurator of the Westminster Assembly of Divines. Christ by his satisfaction only accomplished this much, that God now, consistent with the honor of his justice, might pardon sinners if he willed so to do. According to Arminius, the atonement rendered salvation only possible, and rendered it possible to all men. According to our definition, salvation is rendered certain to some, to the election of grace. The arguments employed by the advocates of indefinite atonement are as follows. Number 1. It alone reconciles the exercise of justice with the doctrine of salvation of free grace. Number 2. It alone lays the foundation for an indefinite gospel offer. And number 3. It alone justifies either the ascription of infinite value to the death of Christ, or the use of those terms of universality employed in Scripture in relation to the extent of the atonement. We shall exhibit, therefore, each of these arguments in order before we proceed to its refutation. Number 1. To reconcile grace with justice in the salvation of the sinner is the Gordian knot, which divines generally have been unable to untie. Upon the principle of an indefinite atonement, the difficulty vanishes. If all the sins of a certain individual have been atoned for by the Redeemer, free grace will not appear in his pardon, because justice would in that case require his salvation. But justice is threefold: commutative, distributive, and public. Commutative justice has no concern in this case. Public justice is satisfied by the atonement, because the governor of the universe displays his displeasure at sin in general in the sufferings of Christ. The exercise of distributive justice is entirely set aside, and herein is grace exhibited. The sinner is pardoned at the expense of distributive justice. Although we have stated this argument with all the precision of which we are capable, we must observe that notwithstanding the show of minute discussion which it makes, its whole force consists in its obscurity, and the confusion of ideas which it produces. The indistinctness of vision which it causes is the only reason for any man's offering his hand to those who, by proposing it, promise to be his guide to the temple of truth. We object to this division of a divine attribute. We object to the use which is made of it. We object to the argument, because it multiplies instead of solving difficulties, and it takes for granted what does not exist, a difficulty in reconciling justice with grace. We object to this division of a divine attribute. It is not correct, even as it applies to man. We are perfectly aware that the schoolmen, following the steps of heathen philosophers, adopted this division. Suarez builds upon it the doctrine of merit, in order to supply the traffic of indulgences with works of supererogation. See Owen on Justice, chapter 2. But however variously divine justice may be exercised about its several objects, we have no reason to believe that there are three different attributes of justice, or even that the principle in man which induces him to act honestly in commercial transactions and to give to every man his due is in any way different from the principle which influences a good magistrate to conduct with equity his public administration. It is one principle exercised upon various objects. The Scriptures which uniformly ascribe righteousness to Jehovah, and afford instances of its exercise in thrice three various ways, never intimate that there are three distinct attributes of divine justice. And here a footnote. Were this the proper place, it would be easy to show by a criticism on the best writers upon the subject that their definitions of commutative, distributive, and public justice interfere and are otherwise essentially incorrect. We object to the use that is made of this division. There is no reason for excluding commutative justice any more than distributive, as distinct from public justice, from having any reference to the case of the sinner's pardon. We can readily conceive of a civil ruler having independently of his official duties certain private and personal duties to discharge toward those who in the same case are upon terms of equality with himself. But no equality exists between the creature and Creator. The pardon of sin most assuredly approaches as near to the forgiveness of a debt as the remission of a personal offense which has no reference to the divine authority. Sin is a want of conformity unto or transgression of the law. That from Shorter Catechism, question 14. Besides, the Scriptures frequently represent Jehovah condescending to act towards men upon the footing of a previously existing contract or covenant, but never upon the footing of private relation, setting aside his authority. He hath taught us to pray, forgive us our debts, but never to say, pardon private offenses which are no transgression of thy law. We cannot even conceive of the exercise of distributive justice by the Lord, separate from his authority as our king, our lawgiver, and our judge. We cannot conceive that it is matter of indifference whether God does or does not exercise distributive justice towards his creatures, and much less can we admit that even for the sake of mercy he is ever guilty of one act of distributive injustice. We therefore object to the use which is made of this threefold distinction of the attribute of justice. And we also object to the whole argument which it involves, because it multiplies instead of solving difficulties around the doctrine of the sinner's justification. It requires us to believe that God has violated or set aside the demands of distributive justice in the salvation of his chosen, that the sufferings of our Redeemer were the punishment, not of transgressions which are, in fact, committed, but of sin in the abstract, and that public justice requires only an exhibition of the divine displeasure at sin. Sin in the abstract is only a word. Like in algebraical character, it represents all the transgressions of individual persons. These particular sins are realities, but sin in general, or in the abstract, is only the sign, the word, which we employ in reasoning. And here a footnote. Did we deem it eligible to introduce metaphysics into this discussion, we could more effectually expose the idea of punishing a non-entity, sin in the abstract. We are no conceptualists, and the controversy between the nominalists and realists is now at an end. It prevailed long enough. It agitated the European universities, interested thrones, and shed much precious blood. No philosopher will now defend the opinions of the realists. Abstract terms have no counterpart in nature. It is not for the sign, but the thing that Jesus suffered. The word sin, too, represents the transgressions of angels. If the Redeemer suffered for sin in general, he made atonement for devils, although he took not on him the nature of angels. And if public justice demanded no more than the display of Jehovah's hatred of sin, then Christ is dead in vain, for such display is made in the everlasting punishments of hell. But justice demanded more. It demanded the punishment of the sinner, and could not be satisfied with anything short of this unless Messiah should so unite himself to sinners, not only by assuming their nature, but by becoming in law their representative, as to bear all the sins of all the persons for whom his sufferings were intended to atone. We object also to this argument in defense of indefinite atonement, because it takes for granted what does not exist, that if all the demands of divine justice are satisfied to the full by the atonement, then grace is excluded from our pardon. This is not the case. Justice is indeed satisfied. It does not oppose, but demand the salvation of all for whom Christ died. Here is no difficulty, no Gordian knot. Grace reigns through righteousness. We refer our readers to former articles on the subject and conclude our examination of this argument in the words of the Assembly of Divines at Westminster. Although Christ, by his obedience and death, did make a proper, real, and full satisfaction to God's justice in the behalf of them that are justified, yet inasmuch as God accepteth the satisfaction from a surety, which he might have demanded of them, and did provide this surety his own Son, imputing his righteousness to them and requiring nothing of them for their justification, but faith, which also is his gift, their justification is to them of free grace. That from Larger Catechism, question 71.